Disclaimer. Judge Ron Rangel is providing this podcast and website for educational purposes only, as well as to give the public general information regarding topics related to the criminal justice system. The views, thoughts, and opinions of his guest speakers are the speaker's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Judge Rangel. All rise. You are now listening to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel, educating the public and expanding mindsets. Subscribe on our website, beyondthegavelpodcast.com, or your favorite podcast platform for more of the latest podcast episodes and updates.
Welcome to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel. I am your host. This is a special edition of Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel. We had such a great conversation. I just couldn't stop it and keep it to our typical 40-minute format. As a result of that, this is part one of two parts. I know you'll enjoy it. Today in the studio, we have Jason Goss. Jason Goss is an attorney here in San Antonio. Jason, I'm going to let you give us a little bit of information about your background. Tell us who you are, your professional accomplishments, things of that nature.
Sure. So thanks for having me. I'm a defense attorney now, and I've been a defense attorney for the last 5 years, but I grew up originally in Bryan, Texas, which is Bryan College Station, where Texas A&M is. And, I didn't go to A&M because I didn't want to go to school, 3 blocks away from where I grew up. So I went to the University of North Texas, and then I didn't really even think I was going to be a lawyer. And after I got out of college, I didn't really know what I was going to do, and kind of on a whim applied to St. Mary's here in San Antonio and got accepted in 2006. And I was there from 06 to 09. And then once I got here to San Antonio, I just, I fell in love with it. And so I was an intern with the DA's office, the Bexar County DA's here. And then after I got out, I was here for a year, and then back home, they said, well, there's a felony position. Why don't you come back there? So I was a prosecutor back home for about 4 years. And then my law partner right now, Nico LaHood, won his election to be district attorney. Mm-hmm. And when he did that, he asked me to come back and be a part of, the new office that he was trying to build. And so I came back here to Bexar County in 2015, and I was the chief of the 437th, and then I was the chief prosecutor in the 187th. Mm-hmm. So I did that for Nico's entire term, and then Nico lost his next election, and I went out with Nico, and so we've been defense attorney since. So yeah, I've gotten to see both sides, and I've gotten to do a lot of cool cases, both as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney, and got to try a lot of cases. And what we're going to talk about today is probably the case I'm most proud of that I've ever done in my career, and so I appreciate the opportunity to come in here and do that.
Absolutely. Now, you've had a lot of trials, and you're making me feel somewhat old. So you graduated from law school. I was already a judge in Bexar County.
You were. I remember when I was a little intern and you won your election. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm feeling it at this point. Yeah. So let's talk about the case that you're referencing. It is a very well-known case. It's gotten a lot of national media attention. It's fascinating to analyze, and it's a closed case. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing that we can talk about at this point that's going to compromise any sort of investigation or anything like that.
That's true.
It's a case revolving a lady by the name of Janine Jones. You want to tell us a little bit about her?
Yes. So Janine Jones, one of the things, because as you could kind of tell from the intro, like I didn't grow up in San Antonio, but I was born in 1980, and that's going to be important when we talk about this case. I didn't grow up in San Antonio, but I've been here a long time now, and I feel it is my home. My wife and my children are here. And Janine Jones, what I've learned and what I've seen is this case is a deep, deep, deep wound for the people of San Antonio and the people in Bexar County. Mm-hmm. So Janine was a nurse. She was an LVN in the late 70s and early 80s at the Bexar County Hospital, which is now University Hospital, but back then it was Bexar County Hospital. Mm-hmm. And during that time, while she was a nurse on it was called the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, which is where kids, so there's 2 different units. I guess when newborns are sick and they're born sick, they stay in the NICU, which is kind of neonatal care unit. Mm-hmm. Once the kid goes home, and then they get sick and they have to come back, they go to the pediatric intensive care unit if they're that sick. And Janine was the nurse for the pediatric intensive care unit. And during that time, probably a 4 or 5 year span, we believe, and we've proven quite a few, but we believe that she's killed, and she did kill up to 60 or more babies during that time.
That was here in San Antonio?
And that was here in San Antonio at the Bexar County Hospital. And it was, when we think about it, when you talk about like, what 60 babies represents is, I mean, that's 60 lives. That's 60 people that would have children, would have grandchildren, that's 60 babies that belong to families and big families that love them. And so when you think about the devastation of somebody who murders in cold blood 60 or more infants and helpless children, you can understand why I say, I mean, it's a huge, just a scar and a wound that Bexar County has had to carry because of her action.
All the people that have been injured as a result of that.
Yeah. It just goes, I mean, it ripples out like on a lake, right? Yeah. Like it's just thousands and thousands of people that have been affected.
That's terrible. So Janine was a pediatric nurse, right? And apparently there was some sort of an investigation done around that particular time, I guess the early 80s, and Bexar County Hospital tried to figure out what was going on this floor.
Yes. So, one of the, I mean, there's the horrors of just how evil it is to hurt those children. But, one of the other stories about that time was that it was clear to Bexar County Hospital, based upon their internal investigations and things, that they did have somebody who was hurting children on that floor. And then they were able to kind of narrow it down and identify that it was Janine Jones. Mm-hmm. Instead of reporting her to the police, they never did. They never called the police. Mm-hmm. What they did is they said, okay, well, we're just not going to have any more LVNs on this unit, mm-hmm. including Janine Jones, who was an LVN at the time, a licensed vocational nurse. We won't have any more LVNs on this unit. And then they gave her a letter of recommendation that said that she was a fantastic nurse and that anybody would be lucky to have her, knowing that she was the person they suspected of hurting and killing these children. They gave her that recommendation and she went to Kerrville at a little clinic, a pediatric clinic in Kerrville. And that's where she killed Chelsea McClellan, who was the girl that she was eventually convicted of killing.
How did she go about doing this? How did she have an opportunity? And then ultimately, what was it that she did that killed these kids?
Sure. So, what's interesting is on what we found out through, I mean, even back then, but what we found out through our investigation mm-hmm. was that on the pediatric ICU floor, there's like the drugs that you would expect to be dangerous drugs. There is, it's the morphine and it's the big bads and the things that, are illegal and the things that they say, you can't ever have. Mm-hmm. Those are all locked up and you can't get to them and they're very restricted access. But the drugs that aren't locked up are drugs such as Heprin. And Heprin is a drug that sometimes, especially when you have lines going in, like IV lines and some other things, sometimes what'll happen is that blood clots can interfere with that. And so they'll inject heparin, which thins the blood and allows the blood to kind of flow freely. Well, of course, if you inject too much heparin, all of a sudden what'll happen is these babies would start bleeding out of their eyes, out of their nose, out of their mouth. There's kind of a glue that kind of keeps your blood together, and too much heparin would make the glue completely fail and the blood goes everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so heparin is one of those things that wasn't controlled. Dilantin, which was another drug that prevents seizures. So Dilantin is good because it can prevent seizures, but if you get a big needle full of it and inject a baby with it, it makes them have heart attack. Like an 8-month-old baby having a heart attack. Mm-hmm. It makes them stop breathing, makes them shut down. And then in Kerrville, because she didn't have access to some of those drugs, she was using a drug called succinyl choline. And succinyl choline is a drug that it's a paralytic. And so what it does is whenever you go to the hospital, if you ever have to have a breathing tube inserted, mm-hmm. they have to give you succinyl choline to paralyze your muscles, because if they don't, you'll rip the tube out. If you can move, your breathing tube can be dislodged and then you can't breathe. Mm-hmm. And so that drug is for hospitals when somebody has a breathing tube in. But what happened was she was ordering succinyl choline to the clinic. And then when babies would come in, 15-month-olds, 18-month-old babies, they would come in to get their immunizations, like just to go to school and get their shot records. She would instead take succinyl choline and inject them, which would cause it's a paralytic. So if you don't have a breathing tube in, it paralyzes your lungs, all the muscles around your lungs, what you can use to breathe. And you have to have a breathing tube if you have succinyl choline or you'll die. And that's how she ended up killing Chelsea McClellan.
So these cases were coming up. I guess they were being brought to the forefront somehow. The hospitals, the clinics were trying to figure out what was going on with these children. What was the initial case? What was the initial trial? The initial conviction that got Janine Jones, and how is it that all this kind of came about?
So the difference between Bexar County and Kerrville, and San Antonio and Kerrville, is I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, is that San Antonio is a huge city even back then. Mm-hmm. And Kerrville is a very small city, even smaller back then. Mm-hmm. And so when she moved, while she was in Bexar County, she was able to kind of hide in plain sight because she was on a pediatric ICU unit. A lot of times when the kids would die, people would chalk it up to these kids are sick and they're coming in and they had something wrong with them. That's why they're here. And so they died. But when she went to Kerrville, it's this very, very, very small, tight-knit community. And what would happen is that when she got to that clinic, there were 7 children that went to the hospital with breathing problems in the first month. Mm-hmm. And the doctors there are not, they're all very invested in the medical community. There's a small hospital and they're all there. So the doctors there said, we haven't had 7 children in a year from all the clinics in Kerrville come in to the hospital with breathing problems. And we have 7 in a month coming out of that one. Mm-hmm. And so what they did is they called a group, the doctors called the group together. They called the doctor that Janine worked for in, and she was like, I don't understand why. And they said, you need to go back and find out why. And then she found a bottle of succinylcholine, choline, which has no business being in a regular doctor's pediatric clinic, because the only time you'd ever use it is if somebody's on a breathing tube in a hospital. Mm-hmm. So once she found that, she brought it to the authorities. They went and saw the needle marks, that there were needle marks in there and that it had been accessed and it had been used. And Janine Jones was the person who had ordered it on Dr. Holland was the doctor's name, mm-hmm. on Dr. Holland's account. And once they found that, they knew that, okay, that this is somebody's intentionally doing this to the children. And they actually, at that time, they went and Chelsea McClellan died. She had breathing problems and she died. And they went and dug her up and they took samples from her thighs, which is where she would have been injected, because children get injected for their immunizations in their thighs. Uh-huh. They took samples from their thighs and they sent it to Pennsylvania, and a lab there found succinylcholine choline in that sample after the child had been dead for months.
That was in Kerrville.
And that Kerrville did it because they were so, they were very protective and just so shocked and upset, that these children were having these problems. And so once that happened, Johnny Sutton was the DA out there, and Johnny Sutton wasted no time in indicting her for murder. Now, at the time in the 80s, now, if somebody had ever done that to children, that would be a death penalty case. But at the time in the 80s, it was not a capital crime to kill a child under the age of 6 or under the age of 10. Mm-hmm. So it was just a regular murder case, but he indicted her for that. Once that happened, remember, she had already done everything she had done in Bexar County. We know now she's killed dozens in Bexar County mm-hmm. that they hid, and they let her go to Kerrville. Once Kerrville indicted and it became public, then Sam Millsap, who was the district attorney here back in the early 80s, he ended up saying, okay, now we need to do a grand jury investigation because she was here for 5 years. And what must she have done if she did that over there? And that's how the Bexar County investigation came into play.
Mm-hmm. So the initial conviction then in Kerrville happened in about 1984 for murder. Mm-hmm. And at that time, right, just like today, the media loves to put these little tag names on cases. And so this particular case, Janine herself was actually nicknamed the Angel of Death by the media. And so that kind of stuck with her, right, ever since?
Yes.
And so what was the result of that trial?
So she got 99 years in Kerrville. Mm-hmm. So in the jury, that jury in Kerrville, well, they actually didn't try it in Kerrville. They tried it in Williamson County.
That was a change of venue.
It was a change of venue, very much needed, because that jury in Kerrville would, I don't know that she could find a jury anywhere, but Kerrville definitely, those were their babies. Those were their children. Yeah. And they were just, woof.
Yeah. Let's sort of explain to the listeners how a change of venue happens. Right?
Yeah. So basically Janine's lawyers had to go to the court and basically get affidavits from people that come in and say, Janine Jones cannot get a fair trial in Kerr County because the county is so small. And almost like the way that Kerr County was back then, if you even got a jury panel in Kerr County, you would almost certainly have a third of them related to one of the babies that had been hurt and or killed by Janine Jones. And so they were able to successfully argue it. And I think that if I remember right, Mr. Sutton, the DA at the time, already knew that, that there, I think that it wasn't fought very hard because he knew too that there was no way she could get a fair trial in Kerrville.
Right.
And it's not because the jurors there wouldn't be fair-minded. It's that you can't be fair-minded if you're related or you have close interaction and involvement with the victims. Mm-hmm. In the Kerrville case, they used that there were 7 total children that were hurt. One of them died, but the other children were all presented as evidence of her intent. Mm-hmm. So, you take 7 kids in Kerrville, 8 kids in Kerrville, and you're related to almost everybody there. It's hard to get a jury.
It's a small community.
It's a very small community, especially back then. So they went to Williamson County, and there's like an interesting aside. She was in Williamson County at the same time as another serial killer who, the guy who killed Walsh. Walsh is the guy who does America's Most Wanted. And his son was killed.
Right.
So the guy who killed his son was in Williamson County at the time because he killed children in Florida, he killed children in Texas and in Williamson.
And so folks know that Williamson County is directly north of Austin, sort of like the Austin is the urban county. Williamson is in that rural county that's sort of connected to it on the north side. Although lately, the way Austin has grown, it's not quite so rural as it probably was back then.
Yeah, right. It's been kind of absorbed in, but yes, but back then. And what's interesting about that is that they ended up with a correspondence, and I've seen their correspondence, like Janine Jones and the guy's name escapes me, but terrible other serial killer that ended up getting life sentences. But they ended up talking to each other and like writing letters to each other while they were in the jail. And just to have those two prolific, horrible serial killers at the same time and strike up a friendship was interesting. But Williamson County, when they did it, the Williamson County jury gave her 99 years and told Johnny Sutton, if we could have given her death, we would have. We just were upset that we couldn't because she deserves every bit of what she did to those babies. And, and that kind of plays into like how we ended up getting involved, because it's like, well, we're talking about a, 40-year-old case, but what's important about it, I think, to Bexar County is I think we finally, Bexar County stepped up where they needed to eventually, and we were the reasons that Janine stayed in. But one of the things was with these jurors is like, they thought 99 years, she's never going to get out. And it turned out that she was subject to mandatory release and that they were going to have to release her in the spring of 2018.
So she was charged with murder. And at that time, the range of punishment, was it the same as it is now, 5 to 99 or life?
5 to 99 or life.
And she was sentenced to 99. Talk about the mandatory parole laws that existed then and how they affected this particular.
Yeah, sure. So from 1977 to 1987, in Texas at that time, there was a lot of prison overcrowding. We hadn't built as many prisons as we built now. There was a lot of prison overcrowding. And what happened is they made a law that said, look, if somebody serves their time plus their good time credit. And it's kind of difficult to think about, but if you just think about it this way, most prisoners, if they do what they're supposed to do and they go to their programs and everything else, will get either 2 for 1. So 2 for every 2 days for credit for every day they serve, or 3 for 1 for every day they serve. So the good time credit is just basically what the warden will give you if you behave yourself. And the reason that they do that is because it's to everybody's benefit if prisoners have a reason to behave themselves, right? It makes everybody safer in that community. And so they have to it's the carrot and the stick, but they have to dangle a carrot. And so the carrot is you do the things right and you get good time credit. From 77 to 87, though, what happened was they forgot, or they looked over the fact that there can be very violent people who shouldn't be subject to being able to be mandatorily released. So for that 10 years, what they did was they said that anybody can be released under this as long as the time that they've served plus their good time credit equals their sentence. So for Janine, 99 years is her sentence. If she's getting 3 for 1, she serves 33 years, and then that good time credit is 66 years on 3 for 1, and that equals 99. And what the law said was for anybody who is convicted from 77 to 87 must be released after they've served that time. As for her, it was 33 years.
It was mandatory.
Mandatory.
And at that time, those jurors could not have known that would have been the end result of their 99-year.
Prosecutors didn't even know. Sutton got on record later and said, I didn't even realize that was the law. Because they're trying her in 1984. And really the people they didn't understand that, like, if you have a serial killer and you give them a life sentence, that 33 years from now, that means they're getting mandatory release. Like, from 77 to 84, we're talking about 7 years. Nobody who had that kind of sentence was even coming close to being released. So it wasn't really an issue. It started becoming an issue 30 years later.
Why wasn't this a capital murder back then, right? Now we know somebody who murders a child under the age of 10, it used to be 6, but now it's under the age of 10, that is the aggravating factor, the age, which would then make a capital murder come into play. And a capital murder then would have 2 ultimate results, either life in prison without parole or the death penalty. Now, I know that this type of sentence, this type of end result, with Janine Jones is why the legislature ultimately changed the law and made it to where if somebody is convicted of a capital crime, it's life in prison without parole automatically. Why wasn't this in play back then? Do you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, it's kind of like, it's one of those things where I guess, and I don't know. I mean, maybe there were in the 70s and the 60s, and maybe there were in Texas horrible child deaths, but there probably wasn't enough to raise it into the public conscious that would get it to the legislature, that would have an outrage to that kind of extent. But you have somebody like Janine Jones who, I mean, it's monstrous. And, these babies, and I've talked to these babies' parents, and when I talked to them 40 years after those babies died, they talked to me and they cried and they looked like the day it happened.
Yeah.
I mean, they never get past it ever. And you can just see, like, when you're across from that, you just see how horrible what she did. And I think that it would, like you said, like it was stuff like that. And they go, wait, no, you can't shoot somebody because you're mad at them in a bar and have that be the same as if you take a 3-month-old, 4-month-old baby and kill it. Right. And take it away from their parents forever. And so, and especially so any child, and it was under 6, because we think, oh, well, I guess these small children, because, I have small children, and it's just like, you look at them and you just can't even imagine somebody doing that. But now it's under 10, because even you look at a 9-year-old and you just go, I just can't imagine somebody doing that.
Baby. Yeah.
And if we started having people that were killing 11-year-olds, then I guarantee that the legislature will make a child under 14. You know what I mean? Like,
sure.
As the outrage kind of comes, like if we have something like that, but it's just, it's so rare, I think, to have people this monstrous, doing these things.
No, but the 10-year-old child makes sense, though, right? Because in the juvenile system, they can't prosecute a child under the age of 10.
Right.
Therefore, it would make sense that we would classify 10 as sort of being that age at this particular point in time. Obviously, if it goes up, that's something that the legislature could consider.
Sure. But that does make sense, because that's the criminal responsibility age. And they're not an adult by any means, but, they're becoming an adult rather than just like, I mean, and as we all know, I mean, the one thing about children that everybody, we're just all primally like wired for is that they're innocent, and they're they're so reliant on everybody else around them just to make sure that they get through that day.
Sure.
And so it's such a hard thing, with cases like this, and that's why.
Well, all right, let's do a quick Q&A break. We'll be right back. Hey there, Beyond the Gavel fans. We've got some exciting news for you today. We now have a fantastic new feature called Fan Mail. This means that you can get even more involved with the show. Just click the Text the Judge link in the episode description box. With this feature, you can now send in your questions, your insights, and your reviews directly to us. Whether you have a question for the Q&A break, thoughts that you want to share, or just want to tell us how much you love the show, we want to hear from you. We'll be reading your messages during the break, so don't be shy. Text away and join the conversation. I can't wait to see what you have to say. Now let's hop back into today's Q&A break.
This is Q&A with Judge Ron Rangel. Submit your question today at beyondthegavelpodcast.com.
Welcome to the Q&A break. We have a question. I've been seeing around town people holding signs that say 21 plus free marijuana outside of smoke shops. Did Texas make marijuana legal? What do you think, Jason?
Yeah, the answer is absolutely not. It is not legal. There are, I guess, different levels of enforcement depending on where you are in Texas. But I would say that for the most part, even in Bexar County, but everywhere in Texas that I've been to, marijuana is still illegal. Now, as far as issues that has come up is that the legislature made hemp legal and marijuana illegal, which means that there can be some THC content that doesn't arise to the level of being illegal, and that would be classified as hemp. The other thing that they've done is a lot of people in places and smoke shops are selling Delta-8 tetrahydrocannabinoids, that's basically, it is legal to buy Delta 8. It is illegal to have Delta 9. And it gets very complicated, but ultimately what we kind of found when I was a prosecutor and a defense attorney is that when you have to make the actual chemical compound illegal, people will just find a different chemical compound that they can do that is not illegal that basically gives you the same effect. So as far as those signs, though, the answer is no. We have had some cases that have arisen where people are buying products in smoke shops that are advertised as Delta 8, and it turns out that it's Delta 9, and those are felony offenses. So depending on where you are, Bexar County is not as harsh, but you go in some of these smaller counties in Texas and you have that much THC, you could be looking at some pretty serious consequences.
Yeah, and importantly, marijuana is still illegal to use recreationally under federal law.
Yep.
So it doesn't matter what state you're in. If you have possession of marijuana, you're still in violation of the federal statutes. In Texas, having an amount of marijuana that is 2 ounces or less is considered to be a Class B misdemeanor. With it comes a range of punishment of up to 6 months in jail and up to a $2,000 fine. Thanks for asking that question. That's a good one. We enjoyed answering that. Keep on asking those questions. Head over to beyondthegavelpodcast.com to send in any questions you may have now. Remember, you can now text the show by clicking Text the Judge to send in your insights, your reviews, and your questions. Now, let's head back into the show.
This is Q&A with Judge Ron Rangel. Submit your question today at beyondthegavelpodcast.com.
Welcome back to the show. I'm here talking to Jason Goss. Well, in Kerrville now, Chelsea McLennan's case resulted in this 99-year sentence. Subsequent to that, then, there was a trial here in Bexar County regarding a child named Rolando Santos.
Yes.
So what was that situation about?
Yeah. So Rolando, I love it. I love the Rolando Santos case because it really shows, there's a hero there that never really got to be a hero. And, it's funny because Ray Fuchs tried that, which he's still practicing. Mm-hmm. You'll see him in court right now.
Excellent attorney.
Great attorney. Mm-hmm. And great attorney. This guy was trying Janine Jones for hurting Rolando Santos back in the early 80s. So my favorite part of that story is that I think he was probably 4 or 5 months old, and he had come back to the pediatric ICU. I don't remember for what, but I think it was pneumonia or something that they felt like they needed to keep him. And then all of a sudden he started bleeding, and he started bleeding freely as if he were getting heparin, which is that drug we talked about. So heparin will make your blood thin out. It'll take that glue and it unglues your blood, and your blood starts coming out everywhere, coming out of your ears, eyes, nose, mouth. And obviously, which is horrifying for a parent to see when a kid's in there for pneumonia. So that started happening. There was a doctor named Dr. Copeland who had just gotten out of medical school. He was like in his first year of his residency or internship, whatever they do right after they come out. So he is a doctor, but he's very, very young. And he's looking at him and says, he's got an IV line. I want the IV line taken out. Mm-hmm. I want it taken completely out of him, because that's how you would give heparin to a person, is through an IV. So he said, I want the IV taken out. He still keeps bleeding. Mm-hmm. And what they ended up finding later was there was a medical article, like a medical journal article on Janine Jones's in her workspace that talked about what they called subcutaneous heparin injection. Mm-hmm. And so what that means is normally heparin was always supposed to be through an IV, but there was an article that said you could use a needle and inject heparin like into the muscle and under the skin. And so later on they found that, but they didn't know it at the time. But what she was doing is once they took the IV out, she was still injecting him with heparin, mm-hmm. and it was still making him bleed. And so the Dr. Copeland, very young, there is an antidote to heparin. The problem is that if I talked about heparin makes the glue kind of unglue from the blood, there's an antidote that'll glue it all back. But if it's not heparin that's the problem, then that antidote can kill you, because it just makes your blood just block up in your veins, and then no blood will flow through it. Mm-hmm. Right. So it only will work if the blood's been so thinned out that it needs to be glued back together. If the blood's not been unglued, that glue will stop it up, and then then the blood won't go to your brain, and you'll kill it. So he had to make a choice. He was confronted with a choice. This kid is bleeding out of everywhere. He has to rely on his medical experience that he's had thus far. He's having to ignore other people in the room, and he says, I'm giving him this antidote, and he did, and saved Rolando. And once he saved him, he said, get him off of this floor. Somebody up here is trying to kill him. but he didn't know who. So he got him off the floor and Rolando survived. But because of all these actions, and the other thing he did was he said, I want a lab test right now. Even though he's bleeding out and he couldn't wait for the lab results, he gave him the antidote. It worked and it saved him. But he also got a lab test, and that lab test showed that he had ridiculous amounts of heparin in his blood. And that's how Ray and them were able to show that it was Janine Jones. And they tried it as a bench trial to Pat Priest. And then she was convicted. Judge Priest convicted her and then gave her 60 years.
So Pat Priest was a former district judge here. He's since passed away. It hasn't been that long that he's passed away.
No.
Excellent reputation.
Bexar County legend.
Yeah. Absolutely. So that was a 6-year sentence. Was that run concurrent with the sentence in Kerrville?
It was run concurrent. And you'd have to ask Ray about that, because I believe that they definitely asked to stack. And my recollection is that Ray told me that Judge Priest told him, I'm not going to stack him because she's going to die in prison anyway. He also thought that there was nobody that was ever going to let her out. She already had a 99-year sentence. So he gave her 60 and, said, it may be like a bone to the defense lawyer, because you're represent, sometimes judges are kind of like, well, I'll give you this. She can have 60, but I'll run concurrent, because he didn't, and he had every right to expect that she would die. Nobody at that time thought that there was going to be anything like what happened in 2018.
Because we don't have mandatory release anymore.
No,
right?
It's in 87, once it started, everybody started figuring out that, wait, serial killers have to be mandatorily released, and people who have done horrible things and killed entire families have to be mandatory released, and, whatever it was. Once they started figuring that out, they went, no. And so they took out any violent offender. So no person convicted of a violent crime has to ever be mandatorily released. It's always up to the discretion of parole.
And so now, so folks know, somebody gets a 99-year sentence. You'll read online, it says that they're eligible for parole at a certain point in time. Doesn't mean that they're going to come out at that time or ever. It just means whenever the parole board thinks that this individual is fit to re-enter society, then they can do that.
Right. And, as a defense attorney now, I have to inform my clients, who are a lot of times making decisions about, do I take this plea deal? Do I do this? And I have to tell them, I can only tell you when you're eligible for parole, but I cannot tell you when you're going to get it, because that is solely within the parole board's, that's what the parole board decides. And they can decide to keep you in the entire sentence if they want to.
And so folks know the parole board is appointed by the governor.
Yeah.
The governor's office, and so they are part of the executive branch of government, and that has something to do with their decision-making process and when they think everything is correct. So let's fast forward now. So this is back in the 1980s. Rolando Santos then survived, was the victim in this trial. Judge Pat Priest then sentenced Janine Jones to 60 years, ran it concurrent, meaning every day that she was serving for that sentence, she was getting credit for the same period of time as the Chelsea McLennan case. And so how was it then that you came involved? I know Nico LaHood then became our district attorney here in Bexar County.
Sure.
What happened then?
Well, that's actually that's a story kind of near and dear to my heart, because as I said before in the intro, when Nico got elected, Nico was one of my assistant coaches when I was on the mock trial team at St. Mary's.
When was that? When did Nico get it?
He got elected. He was elected in November of 2014, and he took office in January 1st of 2015. When he was elected, that's when he called me and said, "Hey, I'd like you to come back here and I'd like you to do this." And so I said, "Sure." And I wanted to come work for him and with him.
So he was your coach. He recognized the star power that he had in a student, right?
Yeah. I mean, we had a good relationship. When I came out of law school, I tried my first case as a prosecutor in County Court 7 against him, and he whipped me, but and he was very generous, very gracious. And I've always admired him, and I can tell, I tell Nico, I said, look, we can disagree. Out of 100 things, we can disagree about 90 of them, but the 10 things we agree on are the most important things to me. Right. And I just admire him a lot and always have. And so when he called me and I said, okay. And so I did, I left where I grew up and came back to San Antonio. And when I was here, I met who is now my wife. And that's where she kind of factors into this story, because she,
your favorite part of the story.
Yeah. So it's Maritza Stewart, and she was a prosecutor here. She was kind of, she was younger, on the track. But I met her here and we started dating. And originally in early 2015, the investigator in my court was an old SAPD guy from many, many years ago. And now he was an investigator at the DA's office. And he told me he had watched me try a few cases, and he said, I want you I want you to see if you can look at this Janine Jones case, because it's been kind of his white whale. He just doesn't want her to get away with this. And his name is Larry DeHaven, and he's a great man, great investigator. And we were at lunch, and I said, I'll try, if I can. But we started having a lot of trials going and a lot of stuff going on. But we were home. I was home with who is now my wife, but we were dating at the time. And we were watching Forensic Files. And the Genene Jones episode came up, and she's the chief of the family violence unit in Guadalupe County, and she's still a prosecutor, and that's kind of her passion. It's always has been, and so it is protecting children. So we're watching this, and she goes, "What? This is in San Antonio. This person has done this." And at the end of that episode, it said Janine Jones will be released in March of 2018 if there's not any other cases. And she looked over at me and said, "Look, you're in a position you can do something." I said, "Come on, like that." Yeah, Larry talked to me about it, and you're saying, I said, "There's 40-year-old cases. They're as old as I am." The babies that we ended up prosecuting were born the same years that I was. And I just said, "I don't know." And she said, "Nico listens to you. He trusts you. If you go and ask him, you need to do something. You will not live with yourself if you don't do something about it, if you don't try."
And by this time, you had developed a reputation. I mean, you tried a case in front of me as a prosecutor.
Yeah.
And you had success in that case, in that trial. So you were already starting to gain a little steam in terms of the reputation that you have.
Yeah. And we had tried, and Nico and I had tried together, we had tried a case where a guy had shot a police officer in the face when she was responding to a family violence. He had been hurting his wife. And then when she comes in to help his wife, he shot her in the face and she lived. But Nico and I tried that case, and then and so and so that's why my wife was like, "Look, you got to go talk to him. You got to go see." So I went and asked Nico, and Nico, that was one of his campaign promises, because he said, "I don't know what I can do, but I definitely will. I will take it seriously, and I will look at Janine Jones," because people were asking everybody who was running for DA, "What are you going to do about Janine Jones? What are you going to do?" And so,
knowing that there were all these other cases that theoretically could be filed on.
And the main person that was worried about it was Petty McClellan, who was Chelsea's mother, who said, "I got a trial and it didn't give me any closure, but none of these San Antonio babies got anything. They didn't get a trial. They didn't get justice. They were murdered by this woman, and don't ever let her out." And so she was an advocate for the time that her child died in 1981, all the way until she died a couple of years ago. She was an advocate, fierce advocate for her baby and the other babies. And so Nico he had somebody on it, and he said, so I went up to him at a Christmas party, 2016 Christmas party. And I said, "Hey, we got Janine, I guess it's there. Do you know where it's at?" And he goes, "Well, I have somebody that's been looking at it. They haven't really gotten anywhere with it. Do you mind if I look at it?" And he said, Of course, Papa. Of course, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. And so I said, "Okay, cool." And so I went to kind of figure out like where it was. And I realized that it was, they didn't have anything really. They like the boxes that we ended up finding, like we were finding boxes in the DA's office that had like old like baseball trophies on top of it. But then when you pulled it off, there's medical records from Janine Jones kids, like we, as the investigator, we had to go through and look like in all the nooks and crannies up there. But the good thing is that they were there. And so we ended up there. We went to Bear County Archives. We went everywhere.
Now these files are over 30 years old at this time.
Yes.
What are some of the challenges that you had in dealing with that type of evidence?
Sure. I mean, there's physical damage to the files. I mean, they weren't always stored well. There's things that they're foreign to you as far as like looking at it, because we don't do things that way anymore. And so the way that they've written stuff and all that, a lot of the boxes. So we ended up recovering like 35 boxes, like full banker's boxes. A lot of them was grand jury testimony, because the way that this investigation did, like a lot of times, normally in your court, when there's a trial, it's because a police department has investigated it. They've given it to the DAs what their investigation is, and the DAs end up indicting it. And then they bring it to the indictment comes to you, and then they say, "We're going to prosecute this person." And then a defense attorney defends it. In this one, the DA's office itself was the investigating agency. They did everything in the grand jury. Right. So a lot of it was just grand jury files, grand jury stuff, and then whatever medical records we could find. And so that's why I say, like, I can see from a lot of the stuff that how many babies that she did kill, but we only had records and eyewitness stuff and certain things that could tie us to the 5 that we ended up indicting. Because one of the things that Nico always said was, he said, "Look, we're only doing this if we can prove it." He said, I'm not gonna get these people's hopes up because as I mean, his brother brother was murdered. He watched his parents go through that.
Right.
And he said, I will never put any family through that unless we can prove it. But if we can prove it, let's get her, like it's time. And so that's why we ended up, out of all of those cases, it was 5 that we ended up being able to indict. But what ended up happening was so I go and I get the boxes together. So I was a court chief. So I was a first chair in a court. So I'd have to do that by day. And then at night, I would do Janine Jones. And so it's usually about 5 hours a day after I got off, 4 or 5 months.
Every day.
Yeah, every day.
Yeah.
And then and basically, as we built it up, what I could kind of see is, looking at the line prosecutors and everything else from back then, is that they knew that they could prove some of these cases, but the DA and some of the other people in the administration at the time said, why are we wasting judicial resources on a woman that's got 99-year prison sentence? And so that's kind of what was going on. But it did give me a great roadmap to like how I was going to do it. And it was the Joshua Sawyer case that really kind of broke through, because Joshua Sawyer's mother had kept a pristine copy of his medical records that she had received from a civil lawyer on the case. And she brought that into us. And that really cracked that Joshua Sawyer case open.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jason, I've really enjoyed this conversation. In the middle of it, I think we made the decision to make this a 2-part. A lot of information out there. There's a lot of different things that we could talk about as it relates to something like this.
Sure.
I've really enjoyed my conversation with Jason Goss. This is the end of part 1. Please tune in next week to get the continuation of our conversation, part 2 of my interview with Jason Goss. Remember, you can now text the show by clicking Text the Judge to send in your insights, your reviews, and your questions. I'll mention them during the break. We'll be back in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel. Join us in the next 2 weeks, where we're educating the public and expanding mindsets. Head to our website, beyondthegavelpodcast.com, or your favorite podcast platform to subscribe to the latest episodes and updates.